Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly public affairs show. Today, our guest will take us back almost 100 years to the Scopes monkey trial that riveted a nation and has important lessons for us today.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
What was the Scopes monkey trial and why does it still matter today? Our guest, Brenda Wineapple, will tell us. Ms. Wineapple is an award-winning author whose latest book, Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation, looks back on what is known as the trial of a century.
Brenda Wineapple has been a Guggenheim Fellow, received 3 National Endowment Fellowships, and writes regularly for publications such as the New York Review of Books. As journalist Linda Greenhouse writes, in Brenda Wineapple's hands, a century-old event opens a window on our country today when the impulse to label certain ideas as too dangerous to be taught is as powerful now as it was when Tennessee made it a crime to teach about evolution. Brenda Wineapple will be speaking in July 2025 at a Scope Centennial Conference in Chattanooga, co-hosted by the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Center for Inquiry. And we are so glad to have a chance to meet you now, Brenda.
So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad and honored to be with you today.
Your book, Keeping the Faith, is an amazing tour de force. What drew you to this subject?
I have been asked that, and I'm not entirely sure. There are events in American history that sometimes feel to me that they could use a re-examination. And one of the things that I've become very fascinated with are trials, actually. And my previous book was called The Impeachers, and it was about the first ever presidential impeachment, that of Andrew Johnson in the 19th century. And I realized that although I consider myself fairly well educated, I didn't know the first thing about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And so I thought that I should figure out not just what happened, but why I didn't know about it. And the same, to a certain extent, was true with the Scopes trial. Many, many people had come up to me or had said, oh, the Scopes monkey trial, I saw the movie Inherit the Wind, which, by the way, I had never seen. And that was a cultural phenomenon. I think it was originally a play, and it came out in 1960. And many people, lawyers actually, said that they entered the profession because of it. I didn't see it until after I finished the book. But what I also realized that today, many people don't know what the Scopes trial was. And that was a surprise to me. I mean, we learned about it in passing in history classes. And there was a very important book that came out about it a little more than 25 years ago. But that was about it. People, so there's an entire demographic that didn't know about it. So I thought I had written about the 20th century before, and this would be worth looking at. And the more I looked at it, the more fascinated I became with it, because it seemed to me to funnel so many political and cultural and social issues into a single event that took place in Tennessee, a town that nobody heard of, in the middle of the 1920s, that are often thought of as the Jazz Age, the Roaring '20s. So that's what it was. So it was a combination of various things that got me inspired to work on it. One more thing I should mention is that the people who were involved in the trial were phenomenal characters, really. And that to me is so interesting, too, because you had one of the leading criminal and labor lawyers in the United States, Clarence Darrow, who volunteered to defend a man named John Scopes, who had broken the law that you mentioned. And his opponent was a 3-time presidential candidate in the Democratic Party. So all the ingredients for a kind of phenomenal event that many, when it was covered internationally, thought could only happen in America. That's what got me started. It's a long-winded answer, but well, there are many things.
It seems like good timing because the 100th anniversary is coming right up, isn't it?
Yes, but that, it's interesting. That's never in my mind when I'm writing. The books take as long as they take. So in some sense, if I wanted to time it better, it would come out next year. But it came out this year.
Well, this will prepare us. It'll prepare us all to celebrate, right?
One can only hope.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Well, it took about 5 to 6 years, actually.
Well, it shows.
As I said, it takes a long time to do something like this. A lot of research involved. Yes. And don't forget, in the middle was COVID, so that was a little dicey, to say the least.
Well, it's just this amazing distillation of so much information, so much background, and so readable. So, well done.
Thank you.
So, as you say, there's an amazing cast of characters like William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. Right. H.L. Mencken and a supporting cast of ACLU and other attorneys. We knew from the trial that Bryan was a fundamentalist, but I didn't realize before your book that he really was a white Christian nationalist and a racist. Who was William Jennings Bryan?
Well, I hate to start that way because once you say he's a white Christian nationalist and a racist, people tend to tune out, and I think it's important to see people, especially large historical figures, because they're so relevant today, to see them in the round. And actually, William Jennings Bryan was what we would call today, and was actually called then too, a progressive. He kind of leaped onto the scene. He was only in his 30s. In 1896, he spoke at the Chicago Democratic Convention. We all talk about Chicago these days, but not in 2024, not in 1968. In 1896, he jumped onto the stage and he riveted the audience with a speech that many characterize as the best political oratory ever in the United States. And it's really quite something. And what he was talking about is getting away from the plutocrats, the monopolists, the corporate raiders, the people who ignored the little people, the forgotten man and woman. I mean, in a sense, he preceded FDR in that, in many ways. And he galvanized the nation, and he stormed East Coast to West Coast. And as nobody expected, he got the Democratic nomination in 1896. This young man who made this enormous speech, originally from Nebraska. In any event, he was a progressive. He really did want to nationalize railroads, electricity. He backed women's suffrage. I mean, these were really important issues, and they're really still with us today. You have to remember in 1896, women didn't have the vote, for example. And this was before Teddy Roosevelt and trust busting. And it was a real grassroots campaign. We would think of it today as small donations. He didn't have the big money of, say, a McKinley or, the Republicans that he was fighting against. So I think it's important to remember that he evolved over time, and his view of science and evolution really, in some sense, was shaped by two things. One is ambition. Welcome to politics. That's nothing new. And the other is the First World War, which was so horrific and to many, including himself, so needless, and such an explosion of xenophobia and fear of others and anti-German sentiment and many of the feelings that had been circulating in the culture before that, that he blamed science to a certain extent for creating things like poison gas. So there's that. I mean, what you say is true. He was a racist. He was a Christian nationalist. And the second is more important in a sense than the first. The racist was very much, sorry to say, but very much part of the Democratic Party. When you think of the Southern Democrats, that you think of Lincoln was a Republican. Republicans were formed as an anti-slavery party. Democrats were not that. So, as I say, Bryan is a complicated figure, and he was a leader in the Democratic Party. He got the nomination 2 more times. And Woodrow Wilson, put him in the cabinet as Secretary of State, which a position that Bryan resigned from when he thought Wilson was really leading the country and leaning toward England and leading the country to war. So as I say, it's a complicated picture that we have of him. On the more negative side, from my point of view, he was a big proponent of prohibition. From his point of view, prohibition was important because he wanted to get rid of the distilleries and breweries and alcoholism that was ruining the American family. So you see what I'm saying? He's a complicated figure.
But he was sure drawn to that. Excuse me. He was sure drawn to that fight, for Christianity. So you draw this very, I think, sympathetic. What? It's a objective but sympathetic portrait of Clarence Darrow. Can you tell us more about him and how he got involved in the Scopes trial?
In 1896, this pivotal year that nobody remembers, that it seems like the dark ages in American history. In 1896, actually, Clarence Darrow, who was from Chicago, lived in Chicago at the time, and was a lawyer, and he was actually at the Democratic National Convention that year and heard Bryan, and worked for Bryan. I mean, campaigned for Bryan. He was a progressive himself. His politics stayed pretty much the same. They were complicated, but they stayed the same. And he became a very well-known labor lawyer, taking on strikers, taking on labor organizers, and defending people that were labeled anarchists and did what we would consider to be some rather unpleasant things like planting bombs. But in any event, he himself then was, as I say, he was a complicated figure. He evolved, I should say, from being a labor lawyer, as I said, to a criminal lawyer. And his famous case in 1924, you may have heard of it, was another trial of the century. And that was the case of Leopold and Loeb, 2 young men, teenagers, basically, in Chicago, who killed a 3rd young man, teenager, for no good reason, for no reason at all, just because they thought they could. And that crime was so horrendous, so unspeakable, that and so obviously inexplicable that people really wanted them executed. It's hard to imagine that they wouldn't. Clarence Darrow was their defender, not because he thought they were innocent, because they weren't. They had admitted their guilt, but because he hated the death penalty. He hated capital punishment.
The ACLU really was opposed to having him defend John Scopes, the young teacher who was on trial, because they just considered him too radical, I guess because he was known as an agnostic. Is that right?
Yes. John, let me just back up for a second so that everybody, because we should be clear about the Tennessee law that was passed in 1925, basically said you can't teach evolution in science classes, and you can't teach evolution in science classes if because it conflicts with the Bible. By this time, 1925, Clarence Darrow had broken entirely with William Jennings Bryan, whom he thought was a fanatic when it came to Christianity and beliefs in Christianity, literally taking the Bible literally. So when when that law was passed, the community in Dayton, Ohio, a member of the community, read an ad in the Tennessee paper that said the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, would back anyone who broke the law. They wanted to use it as a test case. Part of the reason, the ACLU wasn't very old at the time, and they were looking for test cases. And so John Scopes, who was a biology teacher, substitute teacher, and a football coach, he said, you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. So he volunteered to do this. The ACLU immediately was involved then. Clarence Darrow, who, as I said, thought not only Bryan was a fanatic when it came to Christianity, Christian nationalism, as Dan mentioned, and a kind of zealot who wouldn't listen to reason, he volunteered to defend Scopes for no fee. The ACLU, as you said, Laurie, was a little, how shall I say, hesitant, because Clarence Darrow was so flamboyant, basically. They wanted a strict constitutional case to eventually get this case before the Supreme Court. Clarence Darrow had a different view. He agreed with that, but he knew that given public opinion and given the press, you have to, in some sense, try you have to try these issues in the press itself. And he had no problem.
It became the trial of the century. We'll talk more about that after this break. We're talking with historian and author Brenda Wineapple about her extraordinary new account of the Scopes trial called Keeping the Faith: God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted the Nation.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name's Jarvis, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. There are many reasons why I'm an atheist, but I'll start with the crudest explanation. I'm sure many of you have seen Clash of the Titans or The Immortals or 300, these blockbuster films about ancient Greek or Roman religion, which we now call mythology. But back then it wasn't mythology. It was very real for them. They genuinely believed that you had to put a coin in a person's mouth before they were buried so that they could pay for the literal ferry to the afterlife. Just as many people today believe that they should eat crackers and wine on a Sunday, or that God wants women to hide their bodies under black burqas. Every religion that has ever existed, and there are many, have all believed that they were right, that their rituals and rules and beliefs were 100% correct, and they all thought they nailed it. But where are they today? If they're not completely forgotten, they're on the silver screen, amusing us with their sword fights, animal sacrifices, and oracles. The religions of today are the entertainment of tomorrow. Everyone, I hope, is an atheist about Zeus and Apollo, Juno and Poseidon. I just added Jesus and Muhammad to that list.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with author Brenda Wineapple, who's written a new book just in time for the centennial of the Scopes trial next year about what was called the trial of the century. Her book is called Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted the Nation.
So, Brenda, in reading your book about the Scopes trial, I was so surprised how many parallels I saw from this 1920s case to the political climate today. Do you agree with this general resurgence of white Christian nationalism, book bannings, that kind of thing?
I do. It's in one way, it's very chilling because 100 years is a long time, and then by the same token, you realize it's not that long at all, and there are certain underground, not so much underground strands in American culture that are still very much with us, having to do with, of course, as Dan said before, racism, nationalism, certain points of view about Christianity, whether the nation should be a Christian nation or not, to the exclusion of other religions, other creeds, the ability to have no religion. I mean, that's in a sense what Clarence Darrow is fighting for, the importance of reason and the ability to choose what to believe, where to worship, how to worship. Those are very, very important issues, and they have ramifications, as you said, for education, censorship, banning of books, the First Amendment, the separation of church and state. It's really quite something. And even the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was a shock to me.
Yeah.
And we've seen things like that in the not so distant past that we all remember, I think, too well.
Yes, and I would never compare Bryan to Trump, but there are some parallels there too, because this charismatic person who was pandering, to the masses.
Pandering to the masses in a very kind of anti-intellectual way, talking as if people who live on the coasts or in urban areas are elite, scientists are elite, intellectuals are elite. That's a recipe for a demagogue, and that's where I think today's resonance is very powerful, because we're dealing with demagoguery. For sure. And I too, I wouldn't say Bryan is like Trump or Trump is like Bryan. Bryan, he was an ignorant man. He really meant well. And the good news was he was never elected. That is good news. He didn't have that power, really, in a certain sense, which is important to remember.
I was so surprised to read that there were 650 members of the media there, the press, another 100 photographers crowding in. And this was a town of under 2,000 in Dayton, Tennessee. It just took over, right? And can you
took over.
And it was hot. It was a very hot summer.
Right, that
It
July.
was unbelievably hot. And don't forget, there's no such thing as air conditioning.
Yeah.
The jury had to beg for a fan. I mean, that's really
to be put in the ceiling.
something.
Yes.
Yeah, and they eventually moved the latter part of the trial outdoors because it was so hot and so crowded, as you're saying, Laurie, that the judge was afraid that the ceiling, the floor would break and crash through to the first floor. So they moved everything outside into benches. I mean, it was really remarkable when you think about it. And it was talk about a media event. It was the first trial that was broadcast in Chicago radio. The radio was pretty new at the time. So radio was our social media when you think about it. And so were the newspapermen and the cameramen, because there were a lot of newspapers.
And they also flew those video rolls to theaters, I think for the first time in history, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yep. Newsreels.
Newsreels, yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite the media event, and I think it was mischaracterized and remembered that way because it was kind of labeled, it was a silly event where a town was trying to, very American town was trying to capitalize on this ridiculous thing, a monkey trial, and bring people in and make a lot of money from it, so that they were selling monkey trinkets and there were chimpanzees walking up and down the street. So it was kind of circus as well.
And we don't have a lot of time left, but of course there was that famous cross-examination that you do see in Inherit the Wind. That part was correct, where Darrow cross-examined Bryan, who made some preposterous statements
about the Bible.
And then of course Bryan ended up dying shortly after that.
Yes, Bryan ended up dying. Actually, in Dayton, when you think about it, I mean, he never really left town. And what was it? H.L. Mencken, the kind of acerbic journalist, said God shot an arrow at Darrow and missed and hit Bryan, because everyone thought, Darrow was the devil coming to undo Christianity. Bryan said this is a duel to the death about Christianity, which of course it was not. But the trial did go to the Tennessee Supreme Court. Darrow did argue it there. I won't give everything away that happened, but it was a very interesting kind of after trial. And as you said initially, Laurie, the ACLU was still trying to get rid of Darrow.
Well, we don't have time to talk about it, but the Freedom from Religion Foundation took a lawsuit because of William Jennings Bryan Bible College, where they were going into the schools.
Oh, my goodness, of course.
And we became very notorious there. We won that case, but it had been going on for 75 years. So he never left town, as you say, and there were a lot of
he never left town.
ramifications about it. Any final words for us on this?
The final word, I would say one thing, because the question is, really, what is the legacy? Since these are such present issues, and I think the legacy is to learn about the past, and it helps us be very vigilant in the present, and that would be my final comment about this. That I think it's important because we learn about what's going on now through this kind of window.
So, Brenda Wineapple, we are looking forward to seeing you at the Scope Centennial Conference that the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Center for Inquiry will be holding next July 2025.
Wonderful. Looking forward.
That will be in Chattanooga and Dayton, Tennessee. Brenda Wineapple is author of the new book, Keeping the Faith, about the famous trial of the century, the 1925 Monkey Scopes trial. Thank you so much for being with us today, Brenda.
Thank you so much for inviting me. A pleasure, and I look forward to meeting you in person.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.